Welcome to everybody whom I can't see and those who I can see. We welcome you to our special event co-sponsored by the African Studies program of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. What we've got is a very important kind of panel where we can be discussing the subject renewed engagement, religion, ethnicity, and current politics in Ethiopia. It's really important these days, I think, for all of us to pay attention to the rest of the world. If you listen to even the network news and things like that, mostly we're stuck with news about Washington. We're stuck with news about the United States. And we need to be sure that we haven't lost touch with important developments in the rest of the world. And this includes now then a look at important developments in East Africa, the Horn of Africa, and especially focusing on Ethiopia. I think we have a wonderful panel of experts. We have Dr. Adata Barata, who is a professor of anthropology at California State University in Sacramento. And he has conducted a lot of research in Ethiopia. His particular interests have been working on connections between identity, state power, and equal rights. Our second speaker will be Dr. Turya Öztürk, who is at the University of Florida, currently chair of the Department of Religion. We have an anthropologist and a scholar of religion, and he has worked on religious reform movements and ethnicity and politics. His most recent book, which is forthcoming, is called Islam, Ethnicity, and Conflict in Ethiopia, which is a special case study of an insurgency. Our discussant will be our own Lara Smith, who is our resident expert on Ethiopia, who is also someone who has worked on political conflict and ethnic identity and religious identity in Ethiopia. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. I will take the privilege of taking an extra minute. I'm an old man. And I started off by saying this is a wonderful panel. And it is a wonderful panel, but for an old man, it's also interesting that it makes me full of wonder. How did we get here in terms of this subject? When I was a graduate student, I think I would have had real difficulty saying that religion and ethnicity would be a major subject that we would be discussing 50 years, 60 years from now. In the middle of the 1960s, it was a wonderful time where people were trying to tell everybody that religion was going to be finished. I was working on the history of a Sufi brotherhood, and people said, why are you working on that sort of thing when you could be working on what is really the wave of the future, that is radical leftist ideology. And it would have been difficult for me to tell them that by the second decade of the 21st century, that would not be an issue much anymore. But at any rate, it's a question of how we get here, and what we are getting today is the work and the thinking and the analysis of people that represent the new generation. We are no longer in the colonial period. We are no longer in the post-colonial period. We are in the period after the post-colonial period with new ways of important looking at what's going on in Africa. I would just simply say it's fun to read an article like the book and the articles of Professor Öztürk on localized Salafism, which is sort of an Ethiopianized Muslim Brotherhood and so on. Marvelous article on how the Muslim Brotherhood was adapted, Muslim Brotherhood ideology was adapted to local conditions in Ethiopia. Similarly, we have gone beyond the old discussions of tribal self-rule and so on to minority rights, ethnic studies, and I look um, at ethnic self-government as a very interesting article by Dr. Barata. We are in definitely a new generation of studies in politics, religion, ethnicity, identity, and culture in Africa. And our two speakers are leading voices in the new generation, this new generation of scholarship. I would call your attention basically to two administrative things. One, if you have any questions during the presentations, please type them in the chat. We will try to cover as many as possible of your questions during the Q&A period, and so that will be handled when we get there. Secondly, I would remind everyone that this event is being recorded and will be public access, and so that your participation is a recognition that you are in agreement with that public access to this recording. So let us go with Professor Barata and let us start. Welcome to both of you. We're really glad to have you with us.
Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you also, Dr. Smith, for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. Renewed engagement and then even political crisis beyond just the current political situation is included in my title, and I wish part of my title reads better, but it also has to reflect the reality on the ground. So I'll try to be quick as time is limited here, and hopefully we'll have more time for discussion. So what I'll do is both, of course, ethnicity and the current politics or political crisis are complicated and lengthy topics. So what I'll do is I'll just identify a few issues I want to focus on, and then maybe ask a question or two and try to answer those, put everything in as it happens in structural and historical contexts, and then move to the topic itself. So the pictures, it's working here. The pictures here should give us sort of an overview of where things are, especially over the last couple of years, most particularly the last 2 years or so. Ethiopia is undergoing a transition, as many of you might know. So Abiy Ahmed is the face of Ethiopia officially right now, the prime minister. The prime minister came to power 2 years ago, roughly 2 years ago, April 2018, exactly. And it was a very promising start after a rocky preceding 3 or so years of protest. Ethnicity seemed to be the fuel that sort of pushed that reform. And the first 6 or so years of Abiy's tenure in office seemed to have seen really great promising reform measures that included releasing political prisoners that the preceding government had denied that they existed, press freedom, opening of the sort of democratic political space, allowing opposition parties to operate, reform of the electoral board and the courts, and so many really important reforms happened. But probably the most detrimental of those reform measures is, if we can call it a vision, his vision of peace. That everybody is primarily about his decision to boldly create peace with Eritrea. And this is a Nobel Peace Prize occasion, or a photo op based on his Nobel Peace Prize, and it was a great moment in recognition. And the recognition was that peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea would have regional implications. That was true, that was great. But the darker side of that piece is that the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or TP, the most powerful armed group, now an opposition group, one would say, took it, so Abiy's decision to have or to make peace with Eritrea meant for the TPLF a war on them launched from both ends. So that led to a slew of things unravel in an welcome way. So that included is really polarized narratives. TPLF accusing Abiy of being a sellout and non-democratic and anti-constitutional and so forth. And of course, Abiy and his team accusing TPLF of trying to destabilize the nation and being separatists. And so it went really down south, to put it somewhat mildly. This continues to this day. So the second picture here is like the two sort of centers of now tension, Abiy in Addis and Debrecen in Mekelle. Now there is a tense standoff. There is a worry that this might translate into or turn into a violent military confrontation at that point. So far, that has been a worry. But then elsewhere in the country, this is Gedio. I'm sure many of you have seen images or footage from Gedio in the south. I was in Gedio last summer, that is summer of 2019, and this was a heartbreaking situation of humanitarian crisis. A violent conflict had happened between the Gedio and the Guji Oromos, and nobody knows how many people were killed, but the estimate at the time of the internally displaced was at about 800,000, and next door Hawassa was a sign of another conflict. And so that continues. I mean, it continues unresolved, that situation. It is calm now, but quiet in the Ethiopian historical context is usually also a worrisome sign in many ways. Where things stand now, Abiy has moved to arrest some opposition politicians, some human rights activists, some human rights violations are now being brought against the Abiy government. So these are, in short, the kind of crisis, political crisis I'm referring to in the title. So why are these happening now? And what is new about this? Or are these things happening, or violent events happening in different parts of the country? Are they isolated? Obviously, that is a bit of a rhetorical question, but I'll try to trace how they interconnect or what is particular about a specific incidents. Of course, the main focus here is the role of the ethnic factor. Has anything changed about that? Next, please. Issues that are of broad importance, whether this is broader scholarly or thematic or regional importance. So these issues here, in Ethiopia, especially over the last 30 years or so, since what is generally the constitution of what is generally called ethnic federalism, a lot of debate has happened between or on ethnicity and scholarly debate. Terry Ostevo himself probably might comment a bit in his part of the dialogue, or Dr. Smith also, but one fault line now in terms of the sort of political contestation is between folks who call themselves federalists and folks who call themselves unionists. That translates into a sort of debate or contestation between ethno-nationalists and nationalists that seem to sort of subscribe to a version of the ideology of the individual as a citizen. Of course, that itself, liberal individualism, who does back home here in the West, the notion of liberal individualism, it does empower some people, but it does not for everybody. It's good. it appeals to you. Generally, it looks, if you are part of that sort of upper class, the dominant, historically dominant segment of the society, everybody else seem to need, even here in the West, some kind of adjustment, tweaking to that discussion of what constitutes really citizenship. Can you be a member of, or have a strong feeling of, ethnic identity, or a member of ethnic group, and still become a good citizen? Or what is ethnicity really about in the Ethiopian context? So these are part of ongoing debates that probably some of the things I remark might just imply that the relevance of this. A slightly easier issue to point out as a form of debate or contestation is whether or not there is ethnic inequality in Ethiopia, or whether ethnic inequality is the main problem. And just like you would have say here in the United States, there are people who would say race is not a problem. There are people in Ethiopia too who argue that there is no ethnic problem, it's not a problem. And there are people who say Ethiopia is anything but an ethnic problem, or the main problem is really ethnic inequality. But if we put aside the first two bullet points here, we do know that contestations are happening on the ground, conflicts are happening on the ground. How do we explain those then? Is this a form of resistance? Of course, it could be considered a form of resistance, but not resistance somewhat politicized, or what Sherry Ortner might call sanitized form of agency, in a sense that resistance is, it could be resistance, but a messy resistance composed of people who do terrible things also, but also people who fight for legitimate rights and so forth. For me, as an anthropologist, what is really important in all of this is whose experience do we count? There are people who argue that just because they did not witness ethnic discrimination, or ethnic stereotyping, or ethnic inequality growing up, they believe that it didn't happen. This is not Ethiopia. If it happened, that is an isolated event than a structural issue. Whereas there are others who think that no. If you open your eye, if you're willing to look at my experience, I experienced growing up, or now as a member of an ethnic group, I experienced ethnic oppression. I'm also experiencing now ethnic oppression. So all of these are sort of, in experience-wise, both are kind of part of lived experiences, and there's no ground to reject either as, unreal, didn't happen, person is pretending, or just being political. Next, please. So this presentation, of course, counts on a larger body of work, including, I think, in the intro, or in the flyer. My recent book has also been somewhere. So what I try in that book is, obviously, this is not, it cannot be reduced to being just about one thing. It is complicated. So what I try to do is to look at how identities, whether this is ethnic or many others, ideologies, whether this is some notion of citizenship, intersect with state power, resource issues, especially land, and then resistance under the current circumstances. If I focus just on this slide, I guess I can spend my allocated 20 minutes, but let me just make a few remarks here and move on to hopefully give you some empirical observations. I wanted to talk about these from a Southern perspective. I grew up in the South, and much of my research is that region of Ethiopia. And so, I thought, sort of empirically speaking, I could highlight some issues that are pertinent there. But this is the historical, and the historical here is also part of structural, obviously, as it is in many other places. But the question of ethnicity, at least pre-existed. Many people reduce it to, or accuse the TPLF of having invented the ethnic problem. at least it goes back to in official discourse or organized ethnic protests and so forth, goes back to at least the 60s and 70s Ethiopian student movements. Then the nationalities question, also read usually from a sort of Leninist perspective or lens of Marxism. It's complicated, but they were referring to the situation of every ethnic group other than the Amharic-speaking Christian North back in the day. The socialist government answered or addressed the second important question at the time was the land question, but still many ethnic groups in the country did not think the socialist government addressed the ethnic question. Hence, we had ethnically organized movements, Tigrayan People's Liberation Movement, Oromo Liberation Movement, Somali, and so forth. So eventually, they overthrew the socialist government and formally made ethnicity an ideology, a governing ideology. What happened in that process is that still the ethnic question did not get answered. Probably what seems to have happened during the sort of 27 or so year tenure of TPLF is that the state became ethnicized without being democratized. That meant the pains, the hurt, the injustice still continued. Therefore, the protest continued and that pushed Abbott to power. But beside all of this, we do have, next please, questions. Ethnicity seems to be, again, without reducing all of this to sort of instrumentalization or constructivist perspective and so forth, there are real questions that people use ethnicity to sort of get to those questions, issues of governance, issues of land. In fact, perceptions of ethnic oppression are real issues here. So let's come to Abiy Ahmed, the current prime minister. So what I try to do here is look at Abiy's policies. So he inherited a very, to be fair, a very difficult situation, a constitution that is in many ways extremely difficult for him. Now the reading is that Abiy is anti-constitutionalist, or he is, the measures he is taking are anti-constitutional and so forth. But to be fair, it was a very difficult situation. Like I said, the ethnic federalism that was in place, which is still in place, but slightly slightly, at least in practice, a different version now, it sort of really brought to the ethnic groups this non-democratic dictatorial state. The only thing that changed in many places for an ordinary person is that now the oppressors or the bad government is a person who speaks the same language as you. Does it make a big difference? It is a meaningful thing, but it's not enough. Therefore, people protested, and so Abiy then came along or brought or popularized what he calls Medemmer philosophy, roughly translated as togetherness. It's unity, but in a somewhat different or somewhat differently packaged in a way that seems to be a synthesis between the previous or maintaining national unity while also addressing or accommodating the diversity of the nation. Is it working? Some are working. There is no reason to categorically dismiss Abiy's government as a failed state yet, but there is much that is not working. In my research area in the South, many people feel things have gone from bad to worse, primarily because of the security situation. One general observation seems to be that there is a big difference or big gap between Abiy's politics. Abiy is a very good speaker, so he can talk the talk, but what is happening on the ground, there is a gap between what his government is doing. Next, please. As an anthropologist, I would have spent or taken the entire presentation time to explain just this slide, but I did not expect or assume that all of my audience here are anthropologists. But again, a few points here. So part of the crisis here now, if we look at it from an ethnic perspective or focusing on the ethnic factor, but also state-society relations, you have two kinds of conflicts: the inter-ethnic conflict, and then the general sort of rhetoric or dominant discourse in Ethiopia is that this is about the big three. So here you have Oromo about 34%, and then they claim to be the majority, but they are not the absolute majority. The rest of the nation, about 66%, is not Oromo, or the Amhara, about 27%, the rest of the nation is not Amhara. But in context, demography here is a key factor. But the suggestion here is that this is a partial list of conflicts, and here you see this is put together by the armed conflicts location and event data, and so many incidents of conflict. And many of these tell you that we need to look beyond the big three. Ethiopia is composed of all of these territories and groups. And so if there is peace process, negotiation, policy reforms, and so forth, it should pay attention to all of it, not just the big three. Now, many of these conflicts have become also state society conflicts. The conflicts, say, the standoff in Walaita right now, or in Walega, or the standoff between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, these have taken a form of now state society conflict. What is new about this, or what is new about the role of the ethnicity? A lot is new. I wish I had the time to talk about all of it, but let me just make a quick remark about especially the role of ethnicity. Here, the role of social media or technology and then the diaspora have become a big part of the problem. All right, okay, so let me wrap up. And some of the issues I have just raised, we can come back, and if there is time, we can, maybe I can elaborate a bit more. So the points I've tried to make here in these long 20 minutes is that ethnicity is indeed at the front and center of the current political crisis in Ethiopia. And this is no big discovery or big revelation. There are new things happening. There are continuities too. And probably again, Terry will comment on where it intersects with religion and so forth. What is particularly what I thought was worrisome thing about the pattern, the emerging pattern right now, is that Abiy has tried, or Prime Minister Abiy has tried, it seemed like, to chart a new course or a new path between, in terms of balancing or striking a balance between sort of regional ethnic sentiments and national identity. But the dominant feeling that is emerging from many parts of the country is like we are back to square one. Abiy has now resorted to, or increasingly resorting to, military solution, taking military solution instead of dialogue or problem solving and so forth. Not only that, but also his new party, Prosperity Party, and the members are being placed everywhere in the country, and the way decisions are made, the way Abiy himself makes decision, gives many people this worry that maybe we are back to be the case, that is whoever comes out as militarily the winner of this game then takes everything, and then sort of imposes a somewhat draconian notion of a national unity. Anything that, or anybody, any group that opposes the government in power is labeled or accused as treasonous or against the nation's sovereignty or national unity and so forth. So that is, all of it seems to be back. In the middle of all of this, there are questions of injustice that are historically sort of layered that have not been addressed. They still remain. And what we have seen ethnicity doing around the world, or identity in general doing around the world in conditions or contexts of injustice, is that this is an easy tool, or cheap tool in a way, to mobilize people, to appeal to anger or resentment or and its net effect in Ethiopia. Ethnicity has been effective. We have seen TPLF, ethnically organized, overthrew the one of the militarily strongest governments in sub-Saharan Africa. It was overthrown by ethnically organized protest, primarily Oromo and other ethnically organized youth movements. So it has been effective as a tool of protest, but as a tool of governance, it is, it's very bad. It has been divisive, to put it mildly. Also, all of these deemed effectiveness of ethnicity as a tool of protest came at a high cost. Right now, it seemed like we are in a kind of Hobbesian nightmare of everybody being against everybody, or sort of ethnic bad faith. That is, all ethnic groups seem to have or developed some kind of negative view of their neighboring ethnic groups and so forth, and there's generalized national insecurity and so forth. So eventually, again, the nation has to find a way of, one, recognizing these underlying questions of injustice, but also rethinking the relationship between the nation itself and its diverse publics, those including ethnically organized groups. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for being so conscious of the time as well, but we'll still have time for good discussion. Thank you. Okay, Professor Osterberg.
Thank you. I also want to join my friend Data in thanking the organizers for inviting me and putting this up. Very timely topic, obviously. Everyone who visits Ethiopia should be struck by the fact how religion kind of hits you in the face. It's everywhere. It's a highly religious country. But in spite of that, my argument, and I think it's fairly easily proved, is that religion is one of the factors that has been ignored within Ethiopian studies. And that is why when it now becomes more visible than we've seen before, many of us are kind of surprised by where does this come from. But I argue that religion has always been a very important dimension of the conflict picture in Ethiopia, although in a subtle way. So what I would like to do is talk about current events that took place this summer and use this as a case to bring out some ideas about how we could understand the role of religion in Ethiopia's conflicts. I'm not going to go into much of detail, but just a brief overview of the religious landscape. We talk about three major religions in Ethiopia. Well, I don't know if we separate them as religions, but that is the general way to do it. The largest one, of course, is Orthodox Christianity that goes back to the 4th century, constituted by around 45% of the population. And then we have Muslims that constitutes for about 33% of the population. And then Protestant Christianity being around, at least officially since the 2007 census, around 18% of the population. I think it's reasonable to suggest that the latter group has even increased more, but we don't really know. So I want to go back to July. What happened in July, or sorry, end of June, was the killing of Hachalu Hundessa, a very famous Oromo singer that many of his songs has been very connected to the Oromo struggle. He was killed in late June, and the day after, Jawar Mohammed and Bekele Garba, who are now one of the most prominent Oromo opposition politicians. Jawar Mohammed, of course, has been very active on social media during the Oromo protests going back to 2015. So these two events sparked then pretty dramatic protests in many parts of the Oromo region, as well as in Addis Ababa. This was particularly the case for the Rift Valley area and in eastern parts of Oromia. And in one of the larger cities in the Rift Valley, Shashmane, you saw an enormous and rather unprecedented destruction of property, businesses, schools, private homes, as well as killing of civilians. Such killings took place in several other places in Oromia. It's of course uncertain how many that actually were killed, but we definitely talk about more than over 100. The question then that emerges here is, well, that has emerged, is whether this is an ethnic conflict or religious conflict. Is it both? And then do we see an enhanced role of religion as a factor in this conflict during this summer? And I will get back to that towards the end, but it's part of a narrative that has been playing a part of the last few years, where people, particularly from the Christian side, have accused Muslims of being more active in burning churches and so on. So there has been a kind of gradual narrative around this. Now, this talk or this conflict, at least in the way it's presented, of course there are nuances here, relates to the question between Amhara Oromo. The Oromo ethno-nationalism that goes back decades in Ethiopia has been one of the probably most strongest ethno-nationalist movement in Ethiopia. And they have always tried to downplay internal religious divisions. Among the Oromo, you have Orthodox Christians. A large segment of them are Protestant Christians, and there's also over 50% Muslim Oromo, as well as adherent to the traditional Wakefata religion. And in an article that Shetar Turnbull and I published in July, we pointed, in July this year in the Journal of Eastern African Studies, we pointed to the myth of Oromo unity and to several factors, one of which is religion, that complicates this notion of Oromo unity. So that's on the other hand we have here. And then we have Amhara ethno-nationalism. There's a little delay here. Amhara as a concept, as a notion, is very complex. And there's a lot of different ideas, opinions about it. And, but I think it's fair to say that it has proven to be a very elastic notion, in the sense it can be defined, understood in many different ways, and it's very clear that it has shifted over time. What we have seen now is kind of an interesting development, is how ethnic federalism, in a way, has created the emergence of an Amhara ethno-nationalism. If you go back to the imperial period, if you go back to the Marxist Derg period, Amhara was more or less equated with Ethiopianness. It was a national identity, Amharic being the national language. Orthodox Christianity was, at least until 1974, the official religion. But then afterwards, when everything, from 1991, when everything became put into ethnic categories, then Amhara nationalism emerged as one of many different ones. And the most strongest representative of this now is the Nama, the national movement for the Amhara. And even though they emphasize the so-called ethnic aspect of being Amhara, which is connected to the territory of the north, to whatever culture feature they're talking about, there is also a very important part here, and that's the salience of Orthodox Christianity as part of this idea of being Amhara. And it is also even possible, and that's the case in many areas, to say that Amhara is nothing other than Orthodox Christian. And just to give a quick example, if you would go to the Amhara areas in the north and would talk to Muslims, they would never refer to themselves as Amhara, even though they're from the core areas of the Amhara region. If their only language is Amharic, they would refer to the Christians as the Amhara and themselves as Muslims. Now, these two movements here has been, like Dr. was referring to, as part of this is the dimension between the federalist and the unionist. And the complicating factor here, of course, is that, you know, we have the kind of a third thing of Amhara ethno-nationalism. I would dare to say they're a little schizophrenic in the sense of what do they want in terms of being unionist or being federalist. But that's something I would not go further into. This becomes complicated in the eastern parts of Oromia, where you have significant Amhara minorities who are, you know, lived there for generations, and where the Oromo population in the eastern part of Oromia is overwhelmingly Muslim. And that means that the question, though, that emerges is when we had this conflict in July. I'm not saying it was only between Oromo and Amhara, but it was other groups involved as well. But what has been prominent here is what role does ethnicity and religion play relative to each other when we see then conflicts between Oromo Muslim against Amhara Christians. And it's clear that there are both reinforcing and cross-cutting boundaries here. When an Oromo is Muslim, the other is Amhara, in addition Christian, then it reinforces boundaries that become really powerful. So the question then is, are these people, was the violence based on religion? It's not possible, I think, to really demarcate it because the view of the other is so deeply intertwined, where ethnic and religious categories are being applied. But I think what is important is what I alluded to or in the introduction is to the failure to recognize the salience and power of religious divisions. And just to give you an example here, in many parts of the South, and of course in Oromia, you have Showa Oromo minorities. These are Oromo groups that moved in from the central areas around Addis Ababa during the 1940s and onwards, and settled among other Muslim Oromo. And the interesting point here is that they often refer to themselves as Amhara because they were Orthodox Christians. They were never at par with the Amhara settlers, but identify themselves. And what we're seeing now in the case of Bale and Arsi and onwards during struggles and insurgencies and in the current conflicts is that religion has really complicated the intra-Oromo relationship, in the sense that we see through history, my last book is about, that the Showa Oromo sided with the Amhara against the Muslim Oromo. So that creates a complicated dimension in a way when we try to untangle the relative importance of ethnic and religious categories in that conflict. Now, another thing that I want to mention is the narrative of the Neftenia that has really come to the fore in the last year or so. Neftenia refers to, in Amharic, it means literally a man bearing a gun. And it stems back to soldier settlers that came together with Emperor Menelik in the late 19th century, when he led his forces to conquer the south. So these were settlers, soldier settlers, and has later become a priority that is used for Amhara minorities in these areas. And to go back to some of what Data was saying, the notion now that Abiy Ahmed, with his Medemmer policy, underscoring Ethiopianness, nostalgia for the past, has even put him to be a representative of the Neftenia, or sometimes we could talk about sometimes they refer to as a neo-Neftenia. So he is now put in that category. And what I would argue what we've seen is that we have increasingly gone from an anti-government rhetoric that there's been added dimension to that, which has been important to understand this intercommunal violence. It is against the government, but is also seen as when the prime minister is aligning himself with the so-called Neftenia, it opens also the door for increased intercommunal violence that is between Oromo Amhara, between Christian and Muslims. And now that, just to add to this, the question, of course, is the role of religion, or the enhanced role of religion. I should put the question mark here, but nevertheless. In the aftermath of what happened during this conflict, there has certainly been a religious framing, particularly from the Orthodox Church. Where different fact-finding missions that have been sent down to the Rift Valley has concluded that these were people that were killed solely because they were Orthodox Christians. And then later in August, there were some few Muslim leaders that were killed by security forces. And again, from the Muslim side, the idea is that the government is after Islam, has also become put to the forefront. I believe that to say that this is solely a religious conflict is way too simple. And then also I think it's relevant to talk about the question of extremism, or should I put that in quotation mark because I don't really like the term, which has been brought to the front by different sides. And of course, we have seen a growth of different religious reform movements in Ethiopia. Salafis, Tabligis from the Muslim side. We have Muhammad Qudusan from the Orthodox side. And then we could arguably say that the growing number of Pentecostal churches could constitute reform movement. So there's no doubt that over the last decades, the salience of religious identities and belonging has become very important. But I would believe that, well, that's my finding too, that religious reform movements as such has not played a major role here of enhancing the role of of religion. The only, and I'm going on a limb here, the only possible could be the Muhammad Qudusan that has been playing the card of accusing the conflict as being related to killings of Orthodox Christians. And then, like I said, this goes back to, like I said in the beginning, to development that has taken place over several years, where, among others, the construction of the destruction of houses of worship has been a major issue. We know that in the Somali region, in Jijiga, in 2018, there were mosques being, there were churches being destroyed, Orthodox churches being destroyed. But subsequently, there has been a number of stories of houses of worship that has been destroyed, and only a very few of them have been confirmed as true cases. But nevertheless, the perception becomes reality, and this stories that has been shared again and again on social media and told around the country certainly gives away an interpretation that the role of religion is becoming more important. And certainly it has entrenched identities and exacerbated polemic otherings of each one. So how can we make a sense of this complicated landscape here? And I want to, sorry for the unshameful self-promotion here, but actually my book is out. It's fresh from the press a few days ago. And I want to go back to some of the argument that I make in that book, which relates to, I think, much of what we see is the notion I use there of, why is it not moving? Let's see. Of peoplehood. So that's, I think, a better alternative than to talk about ethnic and religious groups as separate categories. I believe there's something called ethnicity. I believe there's something called religious. But as human beings, we always have a range of ethnicity, identities, and various forms of belonging. We're never either one, but we are always many things at the same time. And when we talk about peoplehood, I argue, and I don't have much time to elaborate, but I argue that the two foundational dimensions of peoplehood are religion and ethnicity. And the point to be made here is that these are very effective aspects of peoplehood, of being part of a peoplehood. To be member of a political party, to belong to a Rotary club, to be part of a labor union does not come near the salience, the effectiveness, the affected aspect of ethnicity and religion. And the argument I make is that the major reason for this is that these identities, these dimensions, ethnicity and religion, are largely produced by embodied relationships and emplaced histories. We are from our families, we have our homes, we have our histories. It's not to say that this is primordial, but it's certainly primary in the way that it forms us as human beings and makes us to see this as a very strong and powerful aspect of where do we belong. So in a way to try to understand this complex interrelationship between ethnicity and religion in today's Ethiopia, I think it would make sense to move beyond only talk about ethnic and religious group as something separate, but rather talk about peoplehood, wherein religion, ethnicity plays a role. And then of course, the relevance of each of these dimensions in times of conflict would greatly vary according to what's at stake at the given time. So I think I'll stop there.
Okay, so now we get to turn it to Lara and her responses.
Thank you. I hope you all can hear me. Well, I want to thank both of our panelists for such a rich discussion of, as you know, and really start with Dr. Voll's point at the beginning, which is that when we take a longue durée view of some of these questions, we see persistent themes and we see new themes, or at least themes emerge in different ways. And I will say, I was struck as I was hearing both Dr. Barata and Dr. Ostebo today talk, that when I first went out thinking I was going to study federalism in Ethiopia almost 20 years ago now, in the early 2000s, as a political scientist, and probably it matters what my academic discipline was and the questions that I had about federalism, people assumed that I was going to the north of Ethiopia and to Amhara and Tigray regions. Because I was studying language policy, I went to the south and Oromia. So it's a pleasure to be on a panel with scholars that are thinking about these parts of Ethiopia and their relationship to these broader questions for the country. So it's really, it feels both important and timely, as Dr. Voll said, and really fitting to some of the questions that I have also considered in my own work. So I don't want to take too much time. There's already questions forming, but I wanted to point out a few themes that I saw coming together or speaking to each other in both of our panelists' discussion today as we begin to talk about these. The first is a kind of, the biggest question is this question of citizenship, as Dr. Barata has posed it, the national citizenship versus ethno-nationalist citizenship. But I think, really in a way that very much relates to Dr. Ostebo's comments and argument for a concept of peoplehood that accounts for these identities, but in a particular way. And so, I suspect that there'll be questions and other discussion about those two perspectives. But I would just point out that in a sense, this is all about who is a citizen in Ethiopia today, and a country that, of course, ended a feudal monarchy in 1974, and so is continuing, as all of us are, conversations about who is a citizen and what does it mean to be a citizen within that. And so there's a certain sense that's the history and the specifics are unique to Ethiopia, but those broader questions of who is a citizen and what does it mean to be a citizen, I think really speak to a certain universality of these questions. I think we all appreciated the depth and detail that both of our panelists went into. Clearly, in this question of who is a citizen, what is citizenship, what does peoplehood mean as it's been framed, we can see from both presentations, and I think many of us know from watching Ethiopia, that there are both fault lines and opportunities within that. And that's really what I heard in both panelists, is some tremendous challenges that the country faces, and that we all, I think, care about following greatly. But there are also opportunities because citizenship has been expanded in Ethiopia in the last few decades. And because, as has been pointed out, these are not new things, so to speak, they may be understood differently and operationalized differently. They are opportunities for Ethiopians to continue to think about what citizenship means to them in the modern period. I think the last thing that struck me, and then I'll end my comments, in both presentations, because Dr. Barata talked from the Southern perspective, arguing that, and I think I'm indirectly quoting here, that it's gone from bad to worse from the perspective of many folks in the Southern region. And then Dr. Ostebo pointed out, and highlighted some of the things that have happened even just this year. And of course, if we went back a couple of years or several years, we would see significant instances of violence and insecurity in Oromia as well. And, it always strikes me, and it strikes me in these presentations, but I think this may particularly be true for the Prime Minister's reign right now, which is that security is something that there's sometimes too little of in some places and too much of in other places or times. And that security question, again, is something that underpinned both panelists, but I think wasn't fully made explicit, that when the state does not protect all citizens equally, as we've seen in some of the violence of this year, or when it's overreaching in its security arm, its military arm, in both cases, that really undermines the kind of equal citizenship that I think Ethiopians very much aspire to and want for each other and for themselves and their families and communities. So those are my thoughts, and I again thank the panelists and look forward to the questions and discussion.
Okay, I think we're now set. Let's see, we're looking at it. We've got questions from Allison.
Yes, we will start. We will just take them in the order that they were received. Let's move to a question for Dr. Ostipo. Can you please elaborate what you mean by Amhara identity is schizophrenic?
Yeah, I think maybe that was a little unkind characterization. What I was trying to say is that if you look at older generations of whatever we call Amhara, they have been very adamant of underscoring national identity, or the classical unionist, in the way that being Ethiopia, there's no ethnic groups, we are all Ethiopians, and so forth. But then with this Nama, the new movement coming up, we see a much stronger emphasis on what is like more confined Amhara identity that is territorial, that is related to the northern areas, that emphasizes certain trait of cultural features and so on. But at the same time, they struggle in a way with kind of relating this to a notion of that Ethiopia should same time be unionist or held together, where Amharic should be the national language, and that's what I mean why it's kind of not getting to grip with the inherent contradiction that partly is generational, but also in a way of trying to make sense of the two political trends.
Thank you. The next question for both panelists, or who perhaps just Dr. Ostipo, you have focused more on religion and ethnicity, which is good, but what about political violence and the role of elites and the diaspora in exasperating the situation?
Yeah, well, I was asked to focus on these topics, so hence I did. There is, of course, much to say about actors, political actors, diaspora actors, and so on. And I think what both Data and I have been pointing to is that there is this polarization that is from every side in the way. Where naming and othering has become increasing over the last few years in the way that the different categories of naming becomes inescapable. I'm not sure if I would say that when it comes to religious conflict, that the political actor has, at least from the state side, has exacerbated this, but certainly the social media discourse has not made things easier. They have rather picked this up, and I see from the United States, when I follow Ethiopian discourse on social media, there has popped up a number of actors now that are gaining traction, that is emphasizing the role of religious divisions. So that's from my side.
Let me just quickly react to this question on the role of elites and the diaspora. Obviously, both are not homogeneous groups. I think I concur with Terry on the role of social media, and the so-called elites seem to be now emerged. I mean, who is an elite also these days has become an interesting question. And if by elite we mean people who have, say, access to organize, to agitate, to mobilize folks, social media has had a bit of at least democratizing the space that now everybody who has access to a smartphone seems is able to agitate, organize, and so forth. So but below or beneath all of that noise, there are real questions. Whether it is elites agitating, mobilizing, or engaged in sort of narrowly conceived projects, whether these are power or anything else. Of course, social media in the US too, we know that. Is this also the age of disinformation and so forth? All of that is a problem. But when you have real questions, underlying questions go unanswered, unaddressed, and then when, so the capacity of a government to address these, the ability, the willingness of a government to address these questions, when it's, the deadly mix is when all of these come together. Obviously, there's a segment of the elite that speaks from a genuine, legitimate point of view. And then there is, of course, like elites everywhere. There are controversial elites. There are downright wrong kind of groups and so forth. But it's not just one, a homogeneous group.
Thank you. The next question is also for Dr. Barata. He noted that there are federalist versus unionist groups in Ethiopia. My understanding is the divide is on the level of autonomy regions should have, sort of federalist versus confederalist forces. Can Professor Barata specify which organized political groups are advocating for a unionist Ethiopia?
Did you say federalist versus confederalists?
That's what was written. I don't know if they meant.
To see if I can read the question itself, where maybe I might be able to read it somewhere.
This is in the actual chat, I believe, from Hun. Questions for data at 4:56 p.m. I don't know if you can scroll.
So again, maybe I can or sense the question, sort of add the question to that. So there is, this much is clear. So now federalism or federalists seemed to have a sort of united forces with confederalists. I don't know if that is a term or even if it makes sense in the case of Ethiopia. So we, at least in the past, we had groups whose stated objective is to liberate their ethnic group. TPLF started work like that. The Eritrean Liberation Group did become or make Eritrea independent. So that went beyond the Confederacy. TPLF seems to be on that sort of, if it is a spectrum, then on that sort of confederalist end. We don't know where OLF, the Oromo group, stands, but it seems like at least a significant chunk of the Oromo group does not want an independent Oromia anymore, provided that there is democracy and a functional state, it looks like. So there is a self-named unionist force groups. So those do, in fact, advocate for maintaining Ethiopian unity. But the challenge even there is what is meant by unity and how do you maintain a national unity? So all of these, then there is always these sort of conflicting or different versions or visions or definitions of what maintaining a United Nation takes, what we could change. At least we have tried that over the last at least 100 years. It seemed like quite a few things have not worked, or for many people that approach did not work. So it looks like once again we need to take a hard look at what could be changed, reformed.
Thank you. We'll take a question for Dr. Ostabo. Could you discuss the ways that the 1995 EPRDF Constitution led to disputes over public space among religious groups, as well as religious conflict, if it has at all?
Can you repeat that question?
Sure, sorry. Could you discuss the ways that the 1995 EPRDF Constitution led to disputes over public space among religious groups, as well as religious conflict, if it has at all?
Well, I don't think we should narrow this down to the Constitution only, perhaps, but the Constitution, confirms religious freedom of religious assembly and so on. It confirms Ethiopia as a secular country, but I think it's more important to look at at least initial policies of the EPRDF, reversing the restriction on religious assembly and practice imposed by the Derg. That opened up for religion to become more visible, and moreover so for Islam and then Protestant Christianity to become more visible. And I have in all of my writings argued for that these changes and openness for both Protestants and Muslims to the broader the respective global community has given them more confidence in carving out public space, and that has for many been seen as disturbing, because if one would go back, the dominant religious factor, at least in the public, was always Orthodox Christianity. So the rapid growth of mosques, and even more so of Protestant churches all over the country, has by many seen as a negative development. And there's a general tendency among Christians to say that the mushrooming of mosques, as they always is referred to, is an indication that Islam is taking over the country. I would say that is pretty far-fetched, but it has really brought religion into the public and enhanced pluralism, and then inevitably a contestation of the other. So that's what I can say about that.
Thank you. The next question is for Dr. Ostabo as well as Dr. Smith regarding migration. Can you both speak a little bit to how the growing cross-border mobility of Ethiopian workers, particularly to the Gulf and even to the Levant, may or may not be changing the nature of Muslim identity and politics in that community? And I do recognize how much of a generalization Muslim identity is here. On the flip side, do you see a growing amount of money and influence from the Gulf into Ethiopian Muslim communities at the same time? And what is the impact of that?
Should I go first, Laura?
You should, yeah.
Okay. So there are two questions here. One is the question of migrants to the Gulf, and particularly, it's no doubt that the spread of Salafi teaching in Ethiopia that goes back to 1960s, which my first book is all about, was a result of people traveling across the Red Sea to Saudi Arabia, primarily as students, being enrolled in the Islamic University of Medina. So the senior Salafi scholars we have in Ethiopia today are more or less all of them are educated there. Opportunities for such studies became more and more limited during the 1980s. And instead, what became more important was labor migration, which was not really geared towards seeking out religious education. And so I'm not sure to say that that has become an important factor as such. The general picture after 1991, in terms of global connection, has certainly made the religious landscape more complex, but impulses comes in a form of literature, it comes in a form of later internet, it comes in a form of travel interaction that not only go one way. So it means that when in the Muslim community, what I know most about, the ideological picture is pretty complex at the moment, and it increases to be so. When it comes to Gulf influences, the last Saudi NGO in Ethiopia was International Islamic International Relief Organization that lost its license around 2010, 2011. And since there has not been any organized Saudi organization with a religious flavor in Ethiopia. And there are, I don't know of any major NGO working towards religious affairs being present in Ethiopia. The Yemen war, the conflict with Qatar and so on has created a sort of competition among the Gulf states to gain influence on the Horn, where the Emirates, the Saudis, Qatar has been trying to make its presence known. But this has been more in terms of investments, development, and to secure military bases in the region. And interesting also to see that the Emirates have over the last year actually been very active in Ethiopia, mainly doing development work. I know that they have played a part in renovating 2 mosques in Addis Ababa, but that's all I know in terms of religious engagement. So my conclusion to all this is that there is no empirical evidence to say that Gulf states are nowadays actively involved in trying to shape the religious landscape in Ethiopia.
You know, I think you really answered it much better than I could have. The only thing that I'll add to that, since I have been doing research with irregular migrants, women migrants through Djibouti to the Gulf states, and we don't explicitly ask them about religion, but I would argue that their motivations are economic motivations. It does not appear that there's any religious motivation or influence back, right? That these are economic movements of women and men through that region, both the formal documented and the irregular or undocumented migration is really about economics rather than religious practice in what I have observed that would echo, I think, what Terry is saying.
Okay. The next question is also for Dr. Ostobo. How can a framework of peoplehood be integrated into a political climate where ethno-nationalism is gaining currency? And could it potentially be strengthened by the millions of Ethiopians who have a multiplicity of Ethiopian ethnic identities?
What was the last part you said?
And could it potentially be strengthened by the millions of Ethiopians who have a multiplicity of Ethiopian ethnic identities?
Yeah, for me, this is more of an analytical tool to try to understand some of the inherent complexities that we find in Ethiopia, but also I think around the world. I mean, we can think of the conflict in Northern Ireland and on the Balkans. I think the notion of peoplehood could be very fruitful to try to understand the different dimensions of this. I will argue that surely when you have people with multiple identities or whatever that means, but the notion would be helpful. But I also think that it's helpful in a way when we have, for example, that you are Noromo and you are Orthodox, or you may be a Muslim, and then you would be perhaps a Protestant, or you would be a Sidama, you would be probably a Protestant, and so on. So you would have belongings that are both confined with the ethno-nationalist narrative, but you also would have a belonging that goes beyond it. And then the question is, what form of belonging is most important? And that is something that varies. And I think, you know, the reason why I use this in Ethiopia is because to only think about boundaries in Ethiopia as ethnic, I think we miss a very important part of the picture. The fact that these ethnic categories, they contain much more than the ethno-nationalist movements want us to believe. And I think that's what we've been seeing now with conflicts where the two dimension is playing a role in, and it really complicates what I would argue is often a very simplified picture forwarded by ethno-nationalist movements.
Thank you. Dr. Barata, you mentioned ethnicity as a great tool of resistance, but not for governance. Given the ethnic, I guess, political structure of the country, what are possible ways to harness ethnicity for good governance?
Thank you. At the risk of tweaking the question a bit again, I don't know if I missed, I was stepping in and out, but there was an earlier question. I don't know if you read that question raised by Teferi also about these categories and so forth. So
you can go with that one if you want.
I just wanted to make sure that I didn't. And the question, if it was read, like I said, I was stepping in and out because there is some background story. Never mind. So how could ethnicity be harnessed for good governance? I guess that that question comes down to that. But also it relates to many other questions, including the one earlier Teferi raised about politically charged categories. Is ethnicity, in fact, a useful category? Who can speak for an ethnic group? Indeed, let's say the Oromo as an ethnic group, or the Walaita as an ethnic group, or any other ethnic group. Who? Which group? Because even small ethnic groups have multiple voices. There are internal divisions and so in a sense, in my understanding, the biggest problem is not really ethnicity as such. It is a government that is not democratic, as well as broadly inclusive. In which case, then, if we by some miracle could use, and it should be to use to redirect. I mean, of course, this is personal. Recommendation would be to sort of slowly shift ethnicity towards civic engagement than sort of fanfaring it as a basis or in fact as a sole basis of political organization. So one could in principle, so I'm just thinking loud here, think of a creation of checks and balances, allowing at the very least, so one thing the TPLF government, at least the last 27 years, what we have seen them do is the space for any party, any group that wanted to organize in any way other than ethnically was almost non-existent, so to speak. So that space should be opened. And there is no, by the way, ethnicity being just a form of identity, there is no necessary contradiction between being ethnically organized as well as advocating for a strong national government. So again, not everybody ethnically motivated is crazy or wants to win everything for their ethnic group. There are, like I said again, if, let's say, for some miraculous reason, a federal government, a formula of reasonably balancing these ethnic regional feelings with the need for creating a national unity, it should be possible. One could, again, especially if you allow the broad civic space for, say, there are people who want to organize, say, development or sort of ethnic unities and so forth, without then, if you can somehow create a mechanism of not allowing or capping that ethnic energy short of threatening, say, national unity or national sovereignty or unity of a government. So my worry usually is that we have not had a government that is both willing and capable of addressing these underlying problems. Really, again, if you pushed me, ethnicity is being used as a tool of protest. It's not a goal for most ordinary people. You know, it's not a goal. A goal is to live, to, you know, we're here to live. I mean, most ordinary people would like to live. Ethnicity would not get you to the heavens at any rate. So it might come down to what a government has the willingness and the capabilities, the skills, the experience to manage ethnicity as a challenge.
We are coming up on the end, but there's kind of two questions left. There's a lot of questions, but there's two that if people can indulge maybe one or two extra minutes. First question I wanted to present to both panelists. Can you elaborate on the gendered impact of ethnic conflict in Ethiopia, especially as they pertain to internal displacement? In addition, what role have women played in resistance to political and social marginalization?
I understand that is for Dr. Smith.
It could be for anyone.
You go ahead.
You want me to say, Terry, do you want to? I mean, I can say something. I'd be happy to. I mean,
let's hear.
I don't know how both of you see that question from the vantage point of your research, but I mean, I think clearly the questioner poses the connection to displacement. Women disproportionately have borne the costs of displacement, whether that's arisen from ethnicity, religion, or security issues or other kinds of concerns. So there is definitely a gendered impact to the conflict. And women in Ethiopia have both historically and in the contemporary period, and not just in formal positions, but at the community level, had a role to play in involvement in conflicts. But I think, you know, sometimes that frankly gets drowned out by this kind of attention in Ethiopia to the highest level kinds of gendered leadership rather than what's happening at the local level. And so actually I would pose I would appreciate the question and pose it as something that really actually needs more research, but at the local level, you know, for all of us to engage. So I actually appreciate the question quite a bit.
And if we have time for one more, this would be for all of the panelists. The Ethiopian notion is automatically considered as a notion of Amhara, that is the establishment. If anyone starts to question this ontology, people, the Amharic speaking, start to blame him as extremist, etc. Do you see a way out?
Okay, why don't we go 1, 2, 3? Dr. Barada, Dr. Esteban, and Lara.
So if I, is it my turn? Am I speaking out of turn? Oh, so there is a historical background to that question. So what Amhara means, or why anybody who sort of organized in a way ethnically is labeled as a parochial or dismissed or anti-Ethiopian. There is no point in denying the fact that the Ethiopian state, up until TPLF, was founded on the core of Amharic-speaking Christian North. There is no point in denying that. We just need to, and to deny that is not to advocate for dismantling that nation and starting everything from the scratch. That would be, I don't know what kind of idiocy that would be. But then nobody has a monopoly of extremism in terms of interpretation. There is, believe it or not, you know, an extremist wing of Amharic speaking, or if we can call it the Amhara sort of people, there is a group of, or the extremist wing of Amhara, which is nostalgic for historical Ethiopia, or sort of trying to advocate for the Ethiopian equivalent of making Ethiopia great again, who was great for to begin with, and so forth. But then, of course, on the other hand, too, we do have extremists. Again, we have to face that, whether this is religious or ethnic. Again, we do not have to associate with extremism with any specific ethnic group. Extremism if we define it as a practice, so if you don't care about any other ethnic group than just yours, and there are people who are murdered just because they happen to be of person of the wrong ethnic group and found themselves in a wrong place at the wrong time and so forth. So there are practices, and this might be found in many ethnic groups. But again, let's be honest. Right now, or especially over the last couple of decades, ethnic extremism has been as a term associated with some wing of Oromo movement, and to some extent the Tigrayan movement, and so forth. Or at the end of the day, no nation is that built on anything, whether it is the extremist view of unity or extreme view of religious or ethnic identity. It's just maybe to the extent that they succeed, that's only a temporary victory. And sooner or later, it crumbles. So it crumbles. So again, now the way out is really to sort of, okay, if we can find a place where extremism begins, and where you have legitimate concerns. Like I said, there are people who have had legitimate, painful experience because of their ethnicity. That includes many Oromos, Tigrays, Walaitas, and so forth. There are these questions have to be confronted and addressed. There is no necessary contradiction, again, addressing these ethnically based injustices and building a stronger nation. There is this wrong or bad or false choice between your ethnic identity and your national identity. That it does not have to be choosing between your ethnic selfhood and your national selfhood. For many people, ordinary people, again, these are not a problem. We just need to address, again, probably a capable government that believes in, sincerely, again, a negotiated settlement of conflicts. Maybe think, if it is a term, think outside the box and put everything, as a possibility. And from there, I'm sure one should be able to distinguish between the unreasonable, actually extreme wing, and then the reasonable majority in all ethnic groups, I would say, in Ethiopia, that needs a historical, painful, unjust practice to be addressed, and the state to be reformed in a way that is inclusive.
I agree 100% with Data is saying, and what I find to be disturbing is not only how polarized the discourse is, but the lack of any meaningful dialogue. The lack, or it's like everybody sits in their own universe and have no. There's just no meaningful communication. When it comes to violence as such, I think that the critical point here is to move beyond ethnicification of violence, but really to hold the individual who are committing crimes, who are committing murder, accountable. And that harks back to what Laura is saying about security. And security means also justice in the way that individuals need to be held accountable. Unfortunately, the regime has, in the month after this incident, really, I think, not really responded the way they should. Instead, they have gone on a massive, which I think fair to say, politically motivated arrest campaign where thousands of people have been arrested. But I think that's a key thing here to really hold people accountable regardless of ethnic identity. And I would be very reluctant to give an normative things or statement of the way out here. I think that is something that as a Ferengi you shouldn't be doing.
Honestly, I can't add anything to both of those two comments. I really share the perspective of my fellow panelists on that particular topic. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Now we have reached the end of our time, and I want to just do a quick closing of the thing I want to do. First off is to thank the people who made this possible, the staff at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding and in the African Studies program, especially with thanks to, you've seen Allison Jenkins, who has worked especially with the question and answer, the events coordinator of the center, Shireen Durrani, and the person who's done the technical backup for us all, Andrew Condon. Special thanks to those three people for making this possible. And then very special thanks to our two visitors and to Lara for all of the work Lara put in for getting this organized. And I would just close with a quick sentence saying, one of the interesting things of the discussion and the presentation is that in the old days, a lot of these kind of topics were discussed in binary fashion, either this or this, either ethnic or religious, either, and the new mode of this kind of analysis where it's not either or, it's both and, it's synergetic, becomes very important for us to recognize as we're dealing with situations like trying to understand the renewal engagement of religion, ethnicity, and current politics in Ethiopia. Thank you for all, thank you everybody, and for the people who have submitted questions and so on.